So good to see everyone here this morning as we gather together on the Lord's Day and come and worship. We know we have several visitors with us. I have special visitors, Brad and Michelle Bearden from Genoa, and I've known Michelle way back when, and so good to see them here. Sure is. We're in Romans chapter 2, and just to review just a little bit in Romans chapter 1 and bring us up to Romans chapter 2, we are going to remember Romans 1:16, that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. If you read through that, for he said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." And so we talk about the power of God, which is the gospel. And so we preach the gospel, and we obey the gospel, and we live the gospel life. And that's what the book of Romans talks about. And it's good news. Gospel literally means good news. If you would go and you would speak to someone and say, "I've got good news to tell you," you would say at that particular time, "I've got the gospel to tell you." And it came to mean throughout time not just good news, but specifically religious good news. And so that's the gospel. And so Paul said, "I'm not ashamed." If you remember these 5 reasons why I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is good news. And we talked about that in Romans chapter 1. And all these reasons that he would say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Will go and I'll preach the gospel and I'll live the gospel, and I'm dedicated to doing that. And the gospel will change your lives. The gospel will make a difference in your life. And so he preached these 5 things and that was a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the gospel and good news. Sometimes people don't realize it's good news because they haven't heard the bad news. You know, if you went to the doctor and the doctor came to you and said, if I went to the doctor and he said, "Well, Jerry, I've got to do surgery on you." And I'd say to the doctor, "That's not what I came in here for. I don't want to have surgery. That's not good news. You know, I don't want you to go and cut on me and have to stay in here and recuperate and rehab and everything. I don't want that." And he would say, "Well, now, Jerry, if you don't have surgery, you're going to die." And you'd say, "Oh, well, wait a minute. Let's have surgery then." Okay, I thought it was bad news, but it's good news. And so it is that some people don't realize the gospel is good news because they haven't heard the bad news. And last week we started with the bad news. And we talk about the wrath of God. And the wrath of God shall be on those who are, we'll say, unchurched in Romans chapter 1. When you talk about the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Next slide, we talk about the wrath of God. And when we talk about the wrath of God, it is upon those in Romans chapter 1. We talked about this last week, just bringing you up to date. Romans chapter 1, he said, "The wrath of God for these 3 reasons shall be upon the unchurched," we'll say. Those who don't know God. The next slide. Those who don't know God, and those who don't obey God. Those who don't know God, obey His truth. Those who you would say, "Well, you know, I've never really read much about the Bible. Church is not really something for me. I know that you're religious and you know God and pray to God, but that's just not really for me." And he gave these 3 reasons that those who will say are unchurched will have the wrath of God. And we talked about the wrath of God not being something sudden, but something planned. In Acts chapter 17, God says, or Peter, Paul preaching, says there's a day appointed that we'll have the judgment day. God's not just going to fly off the handle because of something and His wrath and anger come upon those who reject Him. But there's a day appointed, the judgment day. And you can just imagine we'll call them the church, reading Paul's letter and saying, "That's right, Paul. Man, those who reject you and reject your word, your wrath shall be upon them," and that's right. And that's good. And they need to repent. They need to change their lives. And they're just going like, sick 'em, Paul. You tell them. Hellfire and brimstone type of preaching. You tell them about the wrath of God because they don't know you, they don't obey you, and they reject you. And then Paul turns to chapter 2, and he talks to, we would say, Christians, the church. And he doesn't give good news to them, and that's where we are today. When we are in Romans chapter 2, Paul said there's 4 reasons for the wrath of God upon Christians. So church, we need to examine ourselves. Oh, we're all for the wrath of God being upon the unchurched, and they ought to know better, and they have the wrath, is upon them, and boy, we're just saying, yes, Paul, yes, you preach it. And now Paul is going to get to us. And 4 reasons, we're going to look at these. How many times have you heard, well, Christians are just so judgmental? Let's go back to those 4. I'm going to go to those 4 first before we get to these. And we're going to go to these. But how many times have you heard that they're just so judgmental? Or all Christians are just self-righteous. And I don't want to be upon those who are just self-righteous. How many times have we heard, well, they're holier than thou type of attitude? I know when Peter says, be you holy, for I am holy. And we are to be holy, but we're not to be holier than thou type of attitude. And then how many times have you heard, well, that church is just full of hypocrites? Well, they're just a bunch of hypocrites living out there. I've seen their lives. I've seen what they say. I've seen what they do. And they're just hypocrites. Paul deals with this. And he talks to the church about this. And he said, you who are saying those unchurched shall suffer the wrath of God, you too better examine yourself. Let's look at number 1 when we talk about, are Christians judgmental? Listen to what he said. Thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou that judgest, for whatever thou judgest another, you condemn yourself. For thou that judgest does the same things. He said, we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. And thou thinkest this, O man, that thou judgest them which do such things, and dost thou do the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? Or despisest thou the riches of goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads thee to repentance? The goodness of God leads us to repentance. There is a day appointed. There's a judgment day coming. And the unchurched and the church will face that. And Paul is talking about those who are pointing the finger. You ought to know better. You ought to get right with God. You ought to come to church. You ought to read the Bible. You ought to pray. You ought to do these things. You know what Mama would say whenever I was pointing the finger? So there's 3 pointing back at me. All right? Well, we're so good at pointing the finger. What did Jesus say about the Pharisees who were saying that you try to get the mote out of your brother's eye and you've got a beam out of your own eye? He said, get the beam out of your own eye. He didn't say there wasn't a mote in the other person's eye. It may be there. There may be something that needs to be corrected there, but you make sure you get that beam out of your own eye. Remember in John chapter 8, turn to John chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. There was a woman brought to Jesus. She had been caught in, and it says, in the very act of adultery. And she was brought before Jesus to see what Jesus would do. And they brought the woman. If she was caught in the very act of adultery, there ought to be a man involved too. He wasn't brought. So there's some, something not right with this from the very beginning. But they brought the woman caught in the very act of adultery. Did she sin? Yes, she did. How's Jesus going to handle this? What's he going to do? Is he going to point the finger? He did. But he pointed the finger at them. And what did he say to them? Let him that is without sin cast the first stone. He didn't say she didn't sin. He just saying, you who brought this sinner before me, realize you sin also. Let's watch who we point the finger at, isn't it? This is one of the things that the world, as they look at Christians and Christianity and church, and how many times do people quote Matthew 7 verse 1 where it says, judge not that you be not judged. It's not that she didn't sin. It's not that sin is bad, and sin is why Jesus went to the cross and shed his blood for sin. He knew the price for sin. He knew the consequences of sin. He's not overlooking sin. He's not making light of sin. He's just saying, don't point your finger in a judgmental manner towards sin. We often say that we hate the sin but love the sinner. And love is involved in there. And so when he says that you pointing the finger at them, just remember that you're doing the same thing. You are the judgment of God also. Watch it. Watch our attitude. Really, he's talking about attitude in these four things, isn't he? Watch our attitude in being judgmental and pointing a finger at those. I'm not saying they're not lost. I'm not saying they're not living a life of sin. But we need to get our life right also as we point them toward Jesus. He's saying judgmental. We can be too judgmental and turn people off. The next one is, what about self-righteousness? Look at verse 5. He said, but after the hardness and impenitent heart, you treasure up yourself unto the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. We talk about self-righteousness. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 4 and 5, that we are, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. He's talking about a sorrowful heart that cares and has compassion toward others. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 6, we were to humble. In James chapter 4, verse 7, we were to humble ourselves before God. Humble ourselves. Not to be self-righteous. It is that we have this righteousness. And Romans chapter 1 does talk about righteousness. And when he talks about righteousness, there is unrighteousness. Right? Doing right and doing wrong is what he's talking about. And sometimes it's just so easy to point the finger at those who are doing wrong. And I call this self-righteousness is lifting ourselves up by putting others down. And that's not how we are to lift ourselves up, is it? The way we lift ourselves up is to be humble. The way we lift ourselves up is to be lowering ourselves. And understanding that people are dealing with sin, and there's sin in the world, and being compassionate toward this. That we humble ourselves before others, that we, Philippians 2, verse 3 and 4, and 5 and 8, to not think more highly than we ought, that to be compassionate toward other people. Caring for others. And you know what the saying is? People don't care how... people don't know how much... people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. And that's right, isn't it? When they know how much you care, they're willing to listen. When they've seen the example of Christ in you, they're ready to listen. Not to be a haughty, separate type of holy type of person, self-righteous. It's not in our righteousness. but in the righteousness of God that we're saved. And so, dealing with self-righteousness. How do we deal with people in the world? And how do we deal with Christians and get in a right relationship with God? And Paul condemns self-righteousness. And then the next one. When we talk about a holier-than-thou type of attitude. I know we are to be holy. Holy literally means separate, separated. We're to be separate from the world. We're to be in the world but not of the world, and we live in the world but we don't live like the world. We're separate from the world. The world ought to see a difference in one who is a Christian and one who's not a Christian. There shouldn't be any guessing about, when you go to school that people would wonder, well, I wonder if they're a Christian or not. Or if you go to work and people say, well, I wonder if they're a Christian or not. Or your neighbors living around you, you say, well, I wonder if my neighbors are Christians or not. There should be no doubt about it. The way you behave, the way you talk, what you do and how you live, there should be no doubt. You ought to be a light shining in darkness, he says. But in Luke chapter 18, Jesus spoke a parable about those who are holier than thou type of attitude. And this is what he said. He said, and he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Luke 18 verse 9. They trusted in themselves that they were righteous. It didn't say they trusted in God that they were righteous. They didn't trust in the righteousness of God. They trusted in themselves and their own righteousness. And he goes on to say this. 2 men went into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men, as extortioners or unjust or adulterers or even this publican. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. I find it interesting when he said he prayed with himself. I once heard a man all wrapped up in himself makes a very small package. But he did mention God, and he prayed to God. Oh, I am so glad I am who I am. And he gave all that he did. And he did. And those are good things. And those are right things. Not condemning the things he did. We're condemning the attitude in which he did it. And the attitude is that he trusted in himself that he was righteous, and he despised others. I'm so glad I'm not like this publican over here. This pitiful, poor soul. Can we see the attitude here? And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much his eyes unto heaven. He smote upon his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And I tell you, this man went down into his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased, and everyone that humbles himself shall be exalted. We can get caught up in a holier-than-thou attitude. I'm better than you because I'm saved and you're not type of attitude. It's not that we're better. And he goes on to say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And all have. He would go on to say, there's none righteous, Romans 3 verse 10. There's none righteous, no, not one. We need to realize, yes, we're saved. Absolutely. But watch our attitudes in this. Watch our attitudes in dealing with others, and watch our attitudes in dealing with the church, with those who are unchurched and those who are church. Watch our attitude in dealing with God even. It's not a holier-than-thou attitude. And then we go on. Have we ever heard, that, that church is just full of hypocrites? Right. Well, look at verse 13 of Romans chapter 2. He would say, for not hearers of the law are just before God, but doers of the law are just. The difference in hearing the law and doing the law. James would say faith without works is dead, isn't he? Hearing and doing. People today would say, well, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? Hearing and doing. There's a difference in it. We come together and you say, well, I go to church every Sunday. I'm here hearing. But what about Monday? Are you out doing? And you talk about hypocrites. And Jesus condemned in Matthew chapter 23. He'd say, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. Now, I don't know people's heart. And I can't look at someone and say, I know your heart, and say you're a hypocrite. But I know Jesus can see their heart. And so there are hypocrites. And Jesus pointed them out and said, you need to change. And you know if you need to change. You see, the Pharisees were great at doing the things, but their attitude was wrong and their heart was not right. He would say, you go out on the street corner and you pray. Jesus did not condemn praying. Absolutely not. But he condemned praying to be seen of men and heard of men instead of humbling yourself before God. He said when you give into the treasury, you sound the trumpet and you make sure everybody knows I'm giving and what you're giving. He didn't condemn giving. He condemned the attitude in giving. To be seen of men, not of God. You hypocrites, he would say. When you mention the name Gandhi, he was a Hindu, and he searched religion, and he read scriptures, and he read the Bible, and he read the New Testament about Jesus. And he talked about Christianity, and he said this about Christianity. He said this, I would be a Christian, but for the Christians I know. Think about that. How many people are out in the world saying, I would be a Christian, but for the Christians I know? Because the Christians I know are hypocrites. And Paul is saying, we shall suffer the wrath of God for being hypocritical in our life. In James chapter 1, verse 26, it says, if any man seems to be religious and does not control his tongue, in that particular example in James, he's talking about tongues. There's a lot of other things. If anyone seems to be religious and can't control their tongue, he deceives his heart. He said he's a hypocrite. And we could go in and fill in the blanks with other things too. If a man seems to be religious and doesn't love his neighbor, he deceives himself. Jesus was asked, what was the great commandment? He said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he added to it, and the second is likened to it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so you could fill in the blank with a lot of things. If any man seems to be religious and doesn't, he deceives himself. Well, Romans chapter 2, Paul's talking to the religious. He's talking to the Christians. He's talking to those who said, yeah, Paul, in Romans chapter 1, they deserve condemnation. They have rejected God. They don't know anything about church, religion, Bible. That's just not their cup of tea. He said, I know they deserve condemnation. And then Paul says, well, now, that's right. But what about you? Do we fall into certain categories of being judgmental or self-righteous or holier than thou or being hypocrites? Do we? If we do, we need to change. If we do, we need to get our heart right. If we do, we need to examine ourselves. We need to know that we need to be righteous, but not self-righteous. We need to be holy, but not holier than thou. We need to judge righteous judgment, but not be in a judgmental type of pointing the finger type of attitude. And hypocrites, I've probably heard that more than anything else as far as people, the reason why people, I don't want to go to church because of, it's just full of hypocrites. Do we realize that's the reputation the world sees in the church? What about our lives? Romans chapter 2. He talks to the church. Romans chapter 3, we'll get into that next week. We'll talk about there is none righteous, no, not one, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we'll talk about that's the problem. The problem is sin. Sin separates us from God. And then that's the situation we'll deal with and how we can get right with God. Dealing next week. Hope you come back next week, Romans chapter 3, and read through that. If there are any subject to the gospel invitation, I want you to respond right now while we stand and while we sing.